All right, good evening again and welcome. We'll give a few more minutes for all the attendees to hop back on. But I'm Mike Day. I'm the director of the Office of Family Life for the Diocese of St. Augustine, and pleased to host again Dr. Jack Daniels for the third part of Tending the Garden, Covenant, and Creation, discussing some of the core themes in Laudato Si, but where these come from, sort of an environmental or integral ecology exegesis of the scriptures there, where we're getting this from, its origins, and actually from the Jewish perspective, the formation that happens there. So if you have any questions, can think of them now. You can ask them at any point in time. There's two ways to interact with us. You can chat by clicking on the chat button below and typing in your question. You can also enter that question into the Q&A button. If you press the Q&A button and enter a question there, all the other participants will be able to see it and can actually upvote it. So if it is a question that they thought of asking too, and they can upvote it, and we'll see filtered through what questions are rising to the top and might be most relevant to you. So you've got two ways to interact with us. You're welcome to ask your questions beforehand. We're going to save them all towards the end, but you're welcome to start thinking about them now. We'll collect them all and do the best we can to answer them at the end of this webinar session. So again, it's my pleasure to introduce for this third part of the series, Dr. Jack Daniels. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Mike. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be back for the third and final webinar in the series, Tending the Garden. I'm pretty excited about this evening's presentation because we'll be diving into some literature in the Bible that's actually my favorite place to be in the Bible. And that's in Jewish wisdom literature. So without further ado, before we move right to the wisdom literature, let's just do a little summary of parts 1 and 2. We found out that creation of beauty and abundance and peace is what God was up to in chapters 1 through 3 of Genesis. And there was no hurting and killing in God's peaceable kingdom in that creation. We also notice that humanity is, from the beginning, intricately connected to all of creation. Humans are fashioned from the earth itself. Adam's name in Hebrew is Adam, and it shares the same root as the word Adamah. Adam from Adamah. Adamah means earth, soil, ground in Hebrew. And all the other living things came from Adamah as well. Humans are given dominion over creation in the first and second creation stories in chapters 1 through 3 of Genesis. But that dominion is a kind of a dominion or lording it over creation with loving care, patience, and mercy to ensure its continued generativity. Fourth, covenant infidelity or sin results in distorted dominion and the possibility of the undoing of creation. We'll speak a little bit about undoing again tonight. Human sinfulness, according to Genesis 1, is characterized by a fundamental self-centeredness, asserting ourselves as being like God, but without God, before God, and not in accordance with God. That comes out in the second creation story of what Christians call the fall. The orientation Psalm 104 is a different creation text in the Old Testament. It asserts a thoroughly integral ecology. It imagines human beings not as having dominion, but as an integral part of God's creation. It's a beautiful psalm. If you weren't here last time, I encourage you to read that when you get a chance. What's strikingly different about Psalm 104 and the other creation accounts in Genesis are that there is no human exceptionalism in that psalm. Human sin or self-assertion is capable of undoing God's creation. We really focused last time on the fact that according to the Hebrew Bible, when human beings commit sin or do not keep covenant, whether with God or with other human beings or with the earth, then creation is undone. We will experience a lot of creation undoing tonight when we get to the book of Job. Number 8, when humans unself themselves, which is the heart of covenant keeping, transformation is possible. And we learned that from taking a close look at Psalm 77, which interestingly is not a creation psalm, but it is a psalm that actually has within the text itself the psalmist moving from disorientation into orientation, experiencing transformation when the psalmist, who is lamenting through most of the psalm, lets go of their self-preoccupation and begins to focus on the other partner in the covenant, and that would have been Yahweh. All right, let's move on to wisdom literature. This is going to be your little introduction to the wisdom tradition in the Bible. But first, wisdom literature is a cross-cultural phenomenon. It's worldwide. Every culture probably has its own wisdom tradition. We can think of our American wisdom tradition in terms of things that you might remember, short little sayings, like the early bird gets the worm, other pithy sayings like damned if you do and damned if you don't. That makes you think about what's going on, or even the saying I'm caught between a rock and a hard place is almost parabolic in form, and so it makes you wonder what's going on there. So wisdom is part of our culture too. Wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible, like other wisdom traditions, it attends to daily life, how to live life wisely, and therefore how not to live life, which I think would be unwisely. It addresses life's challenges, since life's challenges raise big questions about God's character, about God's justice, which the fancy word for that is theodicy, and questions about Israel's relationship to God and to one another. Now, the books in the Bible that constitute the wisdom literature are the book of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, also known as Koheleth, which is a Hebrew word for teacher, the book of Sirach, also known as Ben Sira or Ecclesiasticus, the wisdom of Solomon, and the book of Job. And it's also important to recognize when, especially if you've never read the wisdom tradition before, to understand that it is patriarchal. It's ancient Mediterranean literature. So wisdom is imagined in that culture as being dispensed from father to son. And saying that, something else about wisdom in this culture and in the Bible is very interesting. Wisdom is a woman. In the Hebrew Bible, wisdom is imagined as a woman. Both the Greek word Sophia and the Hebrew word Chokmah are feminine nouns too. And it's really interesting how in the patriarchal culture where this literature emerged and eventually landed in the biblical text, that wisdom is understood to be a woman. And that really comes through clearly and strikingly in Proverbs chapter 8. So let's have a look at this. We'll read the first 5 verses first. Does not wisdom call, and does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights, beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portal, she cries out, to you, O people, I call. And my cry is to all that live, O simple ones, learn prudence, acquire intelligence, you who lack it. And it goes on like that. So here in these first 5 verses of chapter 8, we recognize that wisdom is imagined as being available to all. It's out in the public. It's out there for everybody. And wisdom cries out for everybody to embrace it. Now, later on in that chapter of Proverbs, we have this bit of poetry here, verses 22 to 31, and these are quite amazing. This is coming from the voice of Wisdom Woman, which is actually how scholars of the Jewish wisdom literature refer to wisdom primarily as the wisdom woman. The Lord created me at the beginning of his works, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he had not yet made earth and fields or the world's first bits of soil, when he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the foundations of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race. It is declared here that wisdom was present at the very beginning with God, the first of all of God's creation, at God's side, when God created the cosmos and the earth, and in fact, participated in creating the cosmos as God's master worker, according to verse 30. So it's a really interesting poem that articulates that it's with the touch of the wisdom woman's skillful hand that the cosmos comes into being. Now, Jewish wisdom literature in general employs often meditations on elements of the natural world from which to draw out life's lessons. Now, of course, it employs meditations on all sorts of other things, situations in life, poverty, wealth, injustices, etc. But it also focuses on elements of the natural world as if the sages can look at creation, excuse me, and from the creation, learn something. So here's a proverb, verses 24 to 28 in Proverbs 30. 4 things on earth are small, yet they are exceedingly wise. The ants are a people without strength, yet they provide food in the summer. The hyraxes are a people without power, yet they make their homes in the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet all of them march in rank. The lizard can be grasped in the hand, yet it is found in kings' palaces. So this is a really good example of looking at aspects and elements of creation and then thinking about them and noting something interesting. This is a lot, this is very demonstrative of how much of the proverbial wisdom tradition works. Now, there's different kinds of Jewish wisdom literature. There's conventional proverbial wisdom, and then there's my favorite, subversive wisdom. Now, the conventional proverbial wisdom implies, it underwrites, and it funds a world experienced as orderly, consistent, very predictable, conventional, very secure, very certain. This is definitely proverbial wisdom. Conventional wisdom imagines a world of orientation. It implies that God's orderly, secure, predictable creation is at hand. With respect to the Torah and the worship, this kind of wisdom operates within a scheme common in ancient Judaism called deeds and consequences. What that means is if one acts with wisdom, one is rewarded. or if one keeps Torah, one is blessed. Now, a good example of that in the New Testament, since most of us are more familiar with the New Testament, is in John chapter 9, when Jesus and the disciples are walking into Jerusalem, and they see the man born blind. The first question out of the disciples' mouth is, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So that is working off ancient Israelite wisdom and deeds and consequences. The question is, who sinned, who broke Torah that resulted in this man's blindness? That's the consequence. The deed, the breaking of Torah, the consequence, the blindness. The texts in the Bible that are conventional proverbial wisdom texts include the book of Proverbs, Wisdom of Solomon, and Ben Sirach. Now, subversive wisdom, which is my favorite, it's a sagacious response to proverbial wisdom. It's a response to the deeds and consequences frame. It basically asks the questions, or says this. It says yes to proverbial wisdom. Yeah, things work out that way, but tohu wavohu happens. Chaos happens, whether I'm good or bad, whether I keep Torah or not. So that is a very important element to wisdom literature. It's called subversive, and the texts in the Bible that represent the subversive tradition are the book of Ecclesiastes, or Koheleth, and the book of Job. All right. So for the rest of our time this evening, we're going to spend most of it in the book of Job. And as I already said, this is, I'm not sure if I shared this with everybody or not, but this is actually my favorite book in the entire Bible. So here's a brief outline of the book of Job. It's a very interesting outline. The first two chapters are a prose narrative, and then the last 11 verses of chapter 42 are also a prose narrative. And interestingly, if you take apart, or if you remove that middle section, chapter 3 through chapter 42:6, and squish the first prose and the second prose section together, it almost reads pretty straightforward, as if the poetry was inserted. And some scholars actually think that that was the case. Nevertheless, in the middle, we have this long section of poetry. Now, what I want to do is kind of, for those of you that might not be familiar with the book of Job, we're going to read a little bit of, actually, we'll read quite a bit of the book of Job this evening. And then we're going to get to some other parts of it. Basically, the story goes like this. When you start in the book of Job, the book is very clear. The author is very clear that Job is a righteous man. That's what it says. He was blameless and upright. He feared God, which means worshiped God, and turned away from evil. And so because of that, there was born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he had 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen, and on description of all of Job's stuff, because of the deeds and consequences idea. And it goes on to also describe Job as loving his children so much that he would often go to temple and pray for them and offer sacrifice just in case they were partying too much. That's actually what the text says. It doesn't use the word partying, but that's what the text says. So, and this description of Job being a righteous man ends with, thus Job did continually. Then suddenly in the story, we have this character shows up. There's a gathering of it says that the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and so did, in Hebrew, the Hasatan. Now, the Hasatan in Hebrew sounds, you might recognize the word Satan in that, but the Hasatan in this book is not the pointy-eared devil, or anything like that. The Hasatan here can be translated as the accuser. Now, the Hasatan is a member of God's heavenly court, and the Hasatan's job is to go down to earth, wander about, see what people are up to, and then go back and tell God. So that's what the Hasatan does. Now, what happens here is the Hasatan shows up at this gathering of the heavenly court, and then the Lord sees the Hasatan, and he asks him, "Where have you come from?" And the Hasatan answered, "Well, I've been going back and forth over the earth." And then the Lord says, "Have you noticed Job? He's a really, really righteous man." And so the Hasatan says, "Well, God, does Job fear you for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? Have you not blessed everything that he's touched? God, put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." That's what the Hasatan says. So the Lord says to Hasatan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only upon himself you cannot lay a hand." So the Hasatan goes off. Now, what happens next? It's a very interesting text, because what happens is for the next 7 verses, we have a description, a very vivid description of the undoing of creation and consequences of the undoing of creation. Consequences on Job's property and for Job's family. It goes like this. Now, there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking their wine in their eldest brother's house. And then a messenger came to Job, and he said, "The oxen were plowing, the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabians invaded, and they took them, and they slew the servants at the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you." And then while he was still speaking, it says in the text, there came another and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 companies and invaded and raided upon the camels and took them and slew the servants by the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there another came in and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they're dead. And I alone escaped to tell you." So we have this boom, 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 undoing of creation, one after the other, with all the messengers basically falling over each other to deliver this news to Job. So then Job tears his robe, he shaves his head, falls on the ground, he worships, and he says, "Naked I came forth from my mother's womb, naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And it says, in all this Job did not sin or reject God. So then we have we have another meeting of the heavenly court. And then the Hasatan says this to the Lord: "Okay, skin for skin, all that a man has he'll give for his life, but put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And so the Lord said, "Okay, I'll put him in your power, Hasatan, but you just can't kill." So Job gets all these loathsome boils, and he's sitting on the dung heap, so to speak, and he grieves. His wife ends up leaving him after encouraging him to curse God and die. But then Job's 3 friends show up: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. When his 3 friends come to visit him because they heard about his situation, when they got there, they were really good pastors. It says that they sat down for 7 days and 7 nights with Job and didn't say a word, which is good. But then after that, things changed. The beginning in chapter 3, what we have is 3 cycles of poetry where Job is no longer patient, but he's quite angry. Job and the reader knows that Job is a righteous man. But Job also operates, according to the story, by deeds and consequences, by proverbial wisdom. So he's angry. and he's baffled, and he's wondering why this has happened to him. So what happens is Job utters long poetry about his situation, and his anger at God because God never answers his question or shows up. And this happens 3 times, these cycles. Job goes first, Eliphaz goes next, Job goes again, Bildad goes next, Job goes again, and then Zophar goes next. Now his 3 friends are convinced that Job must have done something bad. But the reader knows, and Job knows, that he is a righteous man. So that's the interesting dynamic of the text. And throughout the poetry of chapters 3, especially through chapter 31, Job is clearly irritated, clearly irate, clearly angry at his situation, and he demands God show up and tell him why this has happened. Well, the problem is that God never shows up. Now, I want to focus on some parts of the text here. There's 3 chapters. These are the last 3 chapters of Job's talking at this point. And it's in these 3 chapters where Job works really hard at asserting himself. Let me go ahead and finish the outline. So it's chapters 29, 30, and 31, where Job, this preoccupation with himself and his situation and his perceived injustice of it all, where he really turns inward on himself. In chapter 29, he remembers the good old days. I'll read a little bit of that. Some of this literature is quite entertaining and a little funny as well. Oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and by his light I walked through darkness. When I went out to the gate of the city, that's where everybody hung out in antiquity. When I prepared my seat in the square, the young men saw me and withdrew. And the aged and the old ones rose and stood, and the princes refrained from talking, and they put their hands over their mouths. And the voice of the nobles was hushed, and their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth whenever I showed up, says Job. Men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel. After I spoke, they did not speak again, and my word dropped upon them. So that's in chapter 29, Job remembering the good old days. Chapter 30, Job remembers the bad new, or thinks about the bad new days. But now they make sport of me. Men who are younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to set with the dogs of my flock. Because God has loosed my cord and humbled me. They have cast off restraint in my presence. And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. And Job goes on and on in this part in this chapter, talking about basically about how he has lost all recognition, all honor, which was the pivotal value in the ancient Mediterranean world. He's lost it all. And it's because of his situation, because apparently everybody thinks, according to proverbial wisdom, that Job must have broken Torah. Now, chapter 31 is Job's final self-assertion, and it comes in the form of Job uttering curses on himself. The way the curses work are, he says, if I've done something like this, then let this bad thing happen to me. And he does this over and over again in a series of curses. I'll read a few of them to you. If I have withheld anything from the poor, if I have withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the fatherless has not eaten of it, If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or a poor man without covering, if I have raised my hands against the fatherless, because I saw help in the gate, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken from its socket. Skipping ahead a little bit. If I have rejoiced at the ruin of him that hated me, or exulted when evil overtook him, if the men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been filled with his meat? If I have concealed my transgressions from men by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, then curse me. And then what I really like is Job's last utterance of a curse. Uh, um, he actually claims that he's a good environmentalist. He says in verse 38, if my land has cried out against me, and its furrows have wept together, if I have eaten its yield without payment, or caused the death of its owners, let thorns grow instead of wheat, and foul weeds instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. All right. So those 3 chapters embody Job's self-preoccupation and self-assertion. He's almost making a case for himself in front of God that apparently isn't there. Now, when you're looking at the book of Job, it continues on from verse 32 through 37 with a new character named Elihu. A lot of scholars think that the Elihu portion of the text may have been added quite late. Elihu is young. It even says how young he is in the text, which would be sort of another way to further dishonor Job as he's being purportedly shamed by a younger fellow. What I want to do is skip ahead to chapter 38, where we get into the parts of this text that have specifically have to do with creation. So it starts like this. Then suddenly, remember, God has been gone for 36 chapters. Then the Lord answered Job from out of the whirlwind. So the encounter with the divine for Job that comes in chapter 8, when God finally shows up, it's in the form of a tornado. This is something awesome, unpredictable, free and uncontrollable, frightening, maybe strangely beautiful as a natural event. But like Israel in the wilderness and the psalmist's lamentations of the definitive encounter with the divine, according to this book, comes in the midst of Job's disorientation. And it comes in a storm. Now, what happens next in the text is God responds to Job's questioning by not responding to Job's questioning. What happens is God gives Job a dose of beauty. So what I want to do right now is read through some of the poetry here in chapters 38, 39, and 40. So the Lord says, where were you, Job, when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? A little bit later on, or who shut the sea with doors when it burst forth from the womb, when I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band? Verse 12, have you commanded the morning since your days began, or caused the dawn to know its place? It is changed like clay under the seal, and it is dyed like a garment. Have you entered into the springs of the seas or the recesses of the deep? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Or have you seen the storehouses of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? He's telling Job to look up. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season? That's a star formation that looks like a crown. Or can you guide the bear with its children? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish the rule on the earth? And then a few more words are said about the clouds. And then suddenly in verse 39 of chapter 38, the divine voice begins to talk about animate, living things. The first part was the inanimate creation, and this part is the animate creation. Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? Who provides for the raven its prey? Do you know when the mountain goats bring forth? I'm in chapter 39 now. Who has let the wild donkey go free? Is the wild ox willing to serve you? The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are they the pinions and plumage of love? For she leaves her eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them. The ostrich doesn't get a good image here, but it is part of God's beautiful creation. Did you give the horse its might? Did you clothe his neck with strength? Do you make him leap like a locust? His majestic snorting is terrible. He paws in the valley and exults in its strength, and he goes out to meet the weapons. Thinking of a war horse here. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. Upon him rattle the quiver and the flashing spear and the javelin. When the trumpet sounds, he says, "Aha!" He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. The description of the horse is wonderful there. And then God moves on to the hawk that soars and spreads his wings toward the south. And then the Lord moves to the eagle who mounts up and makes his nest on high. Then chapter 40 begins, and that's a very interesting part of the poetry, because now God focuses on two particular creatures that God likes. So we've gone over the inanimate creation. We're into the animate creation now. The lion, the raven, mountain goat, and the donkey. And then comes behemoth and leviathan. The whole behemoth. A lot of scholars think it might have been hippo, a description of hippopotamus. The whole behemoth, which I made as I made you, he eats grass like an ox. Behold his strength, the strength in his loins and his power in the muscles of his belly. And he goes on and on about behemoth. And then he moves on to the leviathan. Can you draw out leviathan with a fish hook or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Of course, the answer to these questions is no. Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you put him on a leash for your maidens? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Nope. Lay hands on him, think of the battle, and you will not do it again. It's verse 8, chapter 41. So we had this amazing description. The whole rest of that chapter is a description of Leviathan, which a lot of folks think is a description of a Nile crocodile or something like that. Now, what's important to notice about this poetry is that the content of what scholars call the divine speeches, it's not really a speech, it's poetry. The content of God's response is creation in all of its beauty and freedom. On the one hand, the divine speeches do show that God's power and knowledge surpass Job's. And as a matter of fact, most interpreters interpret what's going on in this text, in these chapters, is God responding to Job and smashing Job. Let me read the start of it again. Then the Lord answered Job from out of the whirlwind, "Who is it that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man, and I will question you, and you shall declare to me." And that actually happens again at the beginning of chapter 40. So there's an interpretive tradition of God's response here as God, number one, not answering Job's question, but just smashing Job and silencing Job. However, there's another interpretive tradition in this text, and that's the one that I want for us to pay attention to. And you can do this by, if one focuses not on the questions put to a silent Job, like where were you or do you know and all that, but rather if you focus on the subjects about which Job is ignorant, the cosmos, the earth, the animals, then one finds oneself blanketed with mind-boggling creativity. The mind-boggling creativity of God. As one theologian puts it, this is God's wild, raging creativity that God blankets Job with. So the divine poetry here doesn't have to be read as God smashing Job into silence, but rather God putting the beauty of the earth and skies on display for Job. God never answers Job's questions about why bad stuff happens to him or happened to him, even though he is truly a righteous man. But what God has done for Job is truly pastoral. Job's experience of the intricacy and awesome beauty of creation does not explain his suffering, but it does transform him. I'll read from the text. "See, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer, twice, but will proceed no further." And then later on, "Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent of dust and ashes." So Job's experience of the intricacy and awesome beauty of creation doesn't explain his suffering. It transforms him. Job now realizes that it's not all about him. He no longer self-asserts. Job's self-preoccupation has come to an end. Now, in fact, many interpreters suggest that from this experience of the beauty of creation, Job gains an expanded moral vision beyond himself, beyond his family, and beyond the village. And this becomes evident, these scholars think, in the second prose section in chapter 42, when Job prays for his friends, because he's a good man. Job's focus is transformed outward, extending beyond himself in his caring for the world. It's really extraordinary the way that Job unselfs himself. If you read Job 40 verses 4 through 5, and then 42, second half of verse 3, and then verses 5 through 6, and then go back and read the poetry section of the Cycles of Speeches and what Job says, it's almost impossible to imagine Job getting to where he is. But he does. And the reason why he gets there is because of creation. So Pope Benedict XVI wrote that the story of the sin of Adam, or Adam, and Eve shows how human beings let themselves be mastered by selfishness, self-centeredness, and so exploited creation out of a desire to exercise absolute domination over the creation. Pope Francis calls all people in the encyclical Laudato Si to a fundamental ecological conversion from self-centered domination and exploitation to an integral, interconnected ecology. Now, I want to suggest that Job's experience of transformation can be ours as well. And it's just such a transformation that Pope Francis calls us to. Catholic theologian and biblical scholar Kathleen O'Connor says this about the creation poetry of the divine speeches in Job. The poetry of the speeches invites us to participate in God's wild, raging creativity, to replicate beauty, to create a new beauty, to generate harmony and wild freedom in our work, in our relationships, to extend our realm of care from our families to the whole cosmos and its denizens, to make a world where creative flourishing is available to all beings. Now, I would submit that such participation in God's ongoing creation and creativity is a good step toward an ecological conversion and the kinship of all creation. All right, that's all I got for everyone. The next couple of slides, the bibliography. I highly recommend you revisit this presentation and maybe get a hold of some of these books. It's wonderful. And then, of course, the images. All right, Mike, I'm going to invite Mike back to field any questions that folks might have, and I will try to offer some kind of answer.
All right. Thank you again very much, Jack. Now, with regards to Job, and that being an example of unselfing oneself, what's interesting about the book is that it never actually sees fulfillment. So he has this process of unselfing, but you don't really see him reaping the benefits of that unselfing. He just kind of comes to terms with it. So as Christians, in what ways does Christ sort of complete that model, and not only shows us it in theory, but also shows us what this looks like lived out in reality?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question, especially because it helps us step back for a second, since probably a lot of people watching this series are Christians. We can put on our Christian glasses and look at the Hebrew Bible. But what Jesus provides for us in his life and his words too is actually what is also provided for us in the Hebrew Bible itself. Because the Hebrew Bible itself, which Jesus quotes on a number of occasions in the Gospels, is, remember, the heart of Torah is not asserting oneself, but being for and about others, not oneself. So Jesus provides for us in his words and his deeds a model of letting go of the self. And the ultimate letting go of the self that Jesus, of course, does is he literally lets go of his life for others, for the whole creation, as a matter of fact. So that's what I think we can find in the Gospels, especially if we attune ourselves to that.
Excellent. Thank you, Jack. Now, staying on the topic of Job, I do have a question here about his reaction. Obviously, he vocalizes a lot of anger, but in the book of Job, does he actually show that anger? Does he act out in anger towards God in a way that would delegitimize his, I guess, keeping of the covenant?
Yeah, no, there are no descriptions in the poetry of Job acting out anger at all. Job is talking. You can imagine Job, if you can imagine, it's kind of like a courtroom setting. Job wants to go to court. Some scholars look at it this way too. Job wants to go to court. He wants a hearing, and he stands at the stands with his hands on the rail, and he rails at God, because Job knows, and the readers know, that Job has done nothing, but this happened, and he wants a hearing. So, again, there's no description of him actually. He lashes out at God with his voice. So that's clear.
Now, we had another question that goes back to a discussion on the Book of Wisdom, and it's about the gender of wisdom. And there's an interesting question there about the reasons for wisdom being presented as a woman. Because in the creation narrative, of course, man came before woman, but in this understanding of wisdom, wisdom precedes mankind. It's there. So, in what is the purpose of portraying wisdom as a woman, and how does that connect to the creation narrative?
I don't know. Um, uh, I of course, what I like about the fact, just generally speaking about the Hebrew Bible, here we have a text in chapter 8 of Proverbs that describes the wisdom woman present before everything else is created, right? But we also have in the Hebrew Bible the creation stories, where Adam is created first, and then you get to the second one, and the woman is fashioned from Adam, who in turn was fashioned from Adam. Now, this is a really good example of this. This isn't really a contradiction. It's somewhat similar to setting up Genesis chapter 1 and 2 and 3 against 104, Psalm 104, with the question, how come human beings are given dominion in these texts, but not given dominion at the creation in this text in Psalm 104? Now, being good Westerners, we don't like things unsettled like that. But as you all know, Mike, when one reads the entire Hebrew Bible, one runs into portraits that create tension. But what's interesting is that we Westerners want to iron out that tension. We want one thing to be right, the other thing not to be right, and we usually we try to do that by ignoring some of the text. We're pretty good at that. But the ancient Israelites weren't apparently concerned about these tensions. So yes, I don't know why within the tradition wisdom is personified as a woman, but wisdom was.
All right, and we have another question about drawing parallels with today. There's no shortage of chaos or tohu wabohu today in myriad forms. So what parallels can we draw today, and what are some examples of how we can be transformed in this moment?
Well, that's a really important question because it gets at transformation, and we all want that experience of transformation. And so, how do we do that? So, I think of we have to put Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a famous Protestant theologian who was killed by the Nazis. He's famous for talking about, I think in the book Cost of Discipleship, he talks about the importance of putting oneself in a position where faith is possible. We're not talking about faith. We're talking about transformation. That's another thing interesting about the book of Job. Job's faith is never questioned. All of that happens within the context of faith. It's just there. But in terms of our own transformation, to put ourselves in a place where transformation is possible, I don't know. I think one thing that we might try to do is, Job is blanketed with creation. That's God's response to Job's questions. Why? To his suffering and the situation. It's just creation. And so maybe if we put ourselves in the creation more often, unfortunately, our culture since the Enlightenment and since the industrial era has had a large tendency of separating ourselves from the creation. I mean, heck, look, we build houses, and some of us like our houses to be airtight. I mean, literally airtight. And if there's dust in it, if there's a bug in it, then there's something wrong. But when you're driving through the country on a rainy day, maybe from Marywood or something like that, and it's pouring down rain, but you notice the horses and the sheep and the cows and the cattle and the birds, they're not scrambling for shelter. I mean, that's their place. So maybe if we can get ourselves, if we can think of ways to blanket ourselves with creation, to get out in it more, that would help us experience the transformation. That's a start.
I think with us all being shut indoors for so long during this pandemic, I think we're all yearning for that anyway. So it's probably a good starting point and a good time for rediscovering the beauty of creation. So, well, Jack, that's all the questions we've got. Any final thoughts?
No, that's. I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to remind everybody that on October 4th at 7 o'clock, Dr. Tim Johnson, my colleague here at Flagler College, is going to offer a talk about St. Francis in creation. So looking forward to that. I hope you attend.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for participating, and have a blessed night.
Good night.
Good night.